you go back to 2001, 2002, roughly speaking, the dawn of the digital music revolution, which company would you have anticipated would have been the big winner in that space? So one very likely candidate would have been Sony. Sony invented the Walkman. Many of you, those of you who are sort of my age, as it were, rather than the next generation, will indeed have owned Walkmans. Sony didn't just have the invention of the Walkman. They, of course, had enormous success in the world of hardware, in software. They even owned a bunch of music. I mean, Sony Music owned back catalogs of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Michael Jackson. Sony had it all. Sony had all of the necessary pieces of the puzzle to become the leaders in what became the digital music revolution. But of course, we all know what happened. Apple stole the opportunity from under their noses. And I found this quote from the Financial Times. I'll just quickly read it. Sony was best positioned for the networked distribution model that Apple ultimately exploited. Sony made the devices, the music players, the phones, the computers, the movie studios, the music companies. They had all of that stuff. But instead of working together, the different business units fought to keep their independence. And I've been reading up on this, and every single separate division of Sony thought that they were going to be the ones that were going to make a play in this fast emerging area. And of course, as soon as different divisions start to compete with each other with different visions, even if they're part of the same overall company, you know that that's going to end in tears. Early attempts to integrate products and create digital content stores to rival what became the iTunes flopped. Apple, of course, a niche player at that point. Remember, Apple was nothing like the company it is today. First of all, they created the iPod, then they created iTunes as a portal through which we could access music, and then, of course, subsequently the iPhone. And, of course, the rest, as they say, is history. Apple, of course, has now dominated this area. And one important point, it's fairly obvious that I'm saying Sony failed to collaborate, whereas Apple did collaborate. But the key point is that if you look at Apple's organization chart, they don't have business units in the way that most companies do. You don't see somebody who's responsible for the profit and loss of iPhones or the Apple Watch or whatever. What they have is essential functional leaders. And the only P&L, the only place where all of the parts come together is right at the apex of the company. So individual units, of course, have targets. They have sales targets and so forth. But the warring you get between business units who each have their own bottom line to worry about just doesn't exist in the same way at Apple as it does at Sony. So there's one little insight there right away, which is that as soon as you create P&Ls, of course there's benefits to doing it, but the costs in terms of a lack of collaboration are pretty clear. So I'm going to address this question, these two questions. How do you improve the quality of collaboration within your organization? And collaboration simply means the activity of people working together to create outputs. And of course, you can have bad collaboration as well as good collaboration. Let's not forget that. What does effective collaboration actually look like in practice? And one way of addressing that question in an interesting way is to think to non-business spheres in which collaboration happens naturally. Now, we can probably debate every single one of these images. Football teams are meant to be highly collaborative. Jazz groups are meant to be highly collaborative. You might be surprised to put universities there, but if you actually think about the way that universities work, the principle of knowledge sharing is absolutely central to any academic endeavor. And so universities are actually pretty good at collaborating. There's lots of things they don't do well, but they're pretty good at collaborating. The bottom left image, I don't know how clear that is. This is CERN. This is the project team which created ultimately the experiment which figured out that the Higgs boson existed. And the academic paper that was written on that had some 5,000 authors, 5,000 people contributed as authors, essentially, to that piece of work. So lots of spheres where collaboration works. And the interesting question you have to ask is, okay, what is it about collaboration in these spheres which is different to collaboration or the attempts at collaboration in the business world? Because most of us would agree that in the business world, like Sony, we struggle a lot to collaborate effectively. And remember, when I'm talking about collaboration, this occurs at any level. It occurs at the level of the corporation as a whole, warring business units. But collaboration is a challenge within teams, within departments. So whatever your level of responsibility, if you like, collaboration is an issue for all of you. And so my big idea here, if you like, is that we are still living with an organizing model, a management model, that is rooted in a very industrial era view of the world. And that's not wrong, but it's not completely right either as we move into this digital era where things work very, very differently. And I'm going to suggest that that traditional industrial era management model, there's a bunch of assumptions that we used to make about how work gets done. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. And I'm going to say, is that traditional thinking actually correct anymore? Can we identify some alternative thinking, some alternative model that would potentially be better suited, not just to collaboration, but to business success even more generally? So it's focused on collaboration, but for me, collaboration is just one part of the story of a high-performance, energized, empowered workforce. And so I'm going to take you through three arguments, which together collectively shape a kind of an alternative worldview of what an effective organization looks like. So we'll take each in turn. Bureaucracy. What is bureaucracy? It's a way of standardizing coordination through rules and procedures. In a bureaucracy, people do things because there's a standard operating procedure for doing things in that way. There's nothing wrong with that, as I say. For certain types of activities, that can be very, very powerful. But there is an alternative model, and it's often called an emergent model, or self-organizing model, in which people choose to work together because they can see what needs to be done. They're not relying on formal rules to tell them what to do. They can see around them the activities and behaviors of the others, and they use that insight to help them figure out what to do themselves. That starts, obviously, with well-intentioned, well-motivated people. But if you've got that in place, then, frankly, the fewer rules you need have, the better. I mean, there are rules of the road in India, but what you're seeing there is not people following formal rules in the way that they would in central London. What they are doing is they are conforming to an unwritten set of norms of behavior. Partly about preservation. Don't hit anybody. Make sure that you get out of the way when a large truck or a large coach comes down the road. But they are also about a little bit of give and take, a little bit of waiting to see what others are doing before acting yourself. So everyone is fixed on what they're trying to do, but there is a process of what you might call mutual adjustment underway that enables this system, in that particular form, to actually work pretty well. And remember, you heard the beeping of the horns. You also see people you can't see the details, but people are actually looking each other in the eye. An awful lot of this works because people are cognizant of what is going on around them. There's a greater, if you like, transparency of what's happening, which enables the collaboration, or this is more coordination than collaboration, if I'm to be honest, than you would see in a traditional city street in London. And just to finish the metaphor off, that model of road traffic design has actually found its way into various parts of Western Europe, thanks to this gentleman here, Hans Monderman, who was this Dutch road traffic engineer who had the bright idea of actually taking out a lot of the formal road systems that we've got in big Western cities. He got rid of the traffic lights in this town called Drachten in the northern Netherlands and replaced it with this shared space. The world was shared space, where the cyclists and the pedestrians and the cars kind of live freely with each other. And I'll be the first to admit that this doesn't work everywhere. If you've got too much traffic, it creates gridlock. This is a nightmare for people who are partially sighted or handicapped. It is not a panacea, but it does open up a fascinating conversation about what would we do in our organizations if we actually freed up the rules, if we actually liberated people just to do the right thing. I've seen companies experimenting with getting rid of the formal structures around project management, formal structures around budgeting, formal structures around claims, expense claims and so forth. In all of these cases, creating a transparent system where people can figure out what they're doing and what they should be doing often works much better than the formal rules. We live in a regulated world. We can't get rid of the rules altogether, but we absolutely can simplify those rules. So that was point number one. Point number two is about the role of hierarchy. And hierarchy specifically means, I mean, you know intuitively what it means, the legitimate authority of one person over another. And most big organizations have moved, whether they intended to or not, towards a very clear sense of hierarchical order. But of course, hierarchies create very clear decision-making processes which are typically silo-based. I mean, there's nothing wrong, again, with a silo, but the notion of a silo is that expertise gets a little bit stuck. And we are kind of deliberately privileging those at the top of the organization. So there's an alternative principle, and that principle is often called collective wisdom, the wisdom of the crowds. And of course, the basic insight there is that by tapping into that collective wisdom of people, by asking people their views, their inputs, and getting them involved in decision-making, we actually end up creating decisions that work for all of those people rather than a few at the top. So what does collective wisdom look like? What are the manifestations of it? I mean, a very famous example is Wikipedia. I don't even need to describe that to you anymore. You all know how that works. A fun example is the old game show Millionaire. You've all seen that show. When the person in the hot seat can't answer the question, they've got a few options. One is to phone a friend, another is to ask the audience. It turns out the friends get the often difficult questions right about 2/3 of the time. The audience have a 91% hit rate. In other words, the average scores, if you look across the audience, 91% of the time, the answer which the audience gravitates towards is the right one. And it's just a reminder that there's these pockets of knowledge across any audience which collectively are typically more thoughtful or ultimately more powerful than the thoughts of any one or two individuals. So we've got to get better at tapping into that collective wisdom. And as I think you'll know, lots of efforts have been made on this over the years. One example, I met this chap here, Jim Whitehurst, a couple of years back. He's the chief executive of Red Hat, which is this software company that provides services on top of the open source software, Linux type platform. And of course, Linux as an open source software movement is all about knowledge sharing. So he's actually created an approach to strategy making in Red Hat, which is all about syndicating the decision making across dozens and dozens of teams. It's a very long and rather painstaking process. But as he says, it takes a lot longer to make the decisions because of that involvement. But once, of course, those decisions are made, we have absolutely no problems in executing them. People have already bought into them. And you can be pretty confident that those decisions are based on a much more collaborative mindset than if he'd made them on his own. So that's the second principle. The third is about how we define and achieve our goals. Short-term financial goals drive greedy and narrowly focused behavior. I mean, that's a fairly strong statement, but I think we recognize it. I will name names. I was with UBS, the Swiss bank, investment bank, in London about a decade ago, running a session for their newly minted managing directors. And UBS has had all sorts of problems, and they are, I believe, coming through them. But at that time, we were having a session really talking about these very same things. And while you could see intellectually the people in the room understood these points about collaboration, it was an unstated fact that every single one of them was essentially being compensated on very, very individualistic measures. And that's the way investment banking has run for decades. And I believe that, of course, is one of the main reasons why investment banking has struggled so much. Not all investment banks are like this. I think Standard Chartered, for example, over the years has actually been quite good at much more collaborative work, not without its own problems. So what is the alternative to this? Because, we work for companies, most of which are quoted on the stock exchange, most of which deliver quarterly earnings statements to investors and observers. Well, we can't get rid of that, but what we can do is append to that a point of view on longer term, or what are sometimes called oblique goals, that help individuals to figure out what it is that the organization is all about. Now, I'm using this word oblique with a particular meaning. Let me just define the word obliquity for you. This is not a word most of you have ever heard before. It was, I think, coined by a well-known economist called John Kay. Obliquity says that goals are best achieved indirectly. If you want to get to point A, you should aim at point B. Now, that sounds completely nonsensical at some level, but let me just substantiate it in a couple of ways. Here is an individual level thought on what obliquity means in reality. Some of you have heard of Viktor Frankl. He survived the Holocaust. He went on to become a founder of a very influential brand of psychotherapy. He said, don't aim at success. The more you as an individual aim at it and make it a target, the more you're going to miss it. Because like happiness, success cannot be pursued. It must ensue as the unintended side effect of a dedication to a cause greater than oneself. And in some level, we all understand that, right? If we're trying to achieve success and happiness in our lives, we do it by trying to do something which is difficult, whether that's climbing Mount Everest or swimming the English Channel, or whether it's just a particularly difficult and challenging and interesting project at work. We feel an enormous glow of satisfaction and achievement when we do that, far more than if you live every day sort of in a, as if you are a kind of a rat in a cage going round in circles. So obliquity says if you've got that higher order goal, you are paradoxically more likely to be successful and happy, even though the attainment of that higher goal is itself quite difficult. And let's just apply that back to the corporate world to make sure we stay on track. I see two different species of companies in the world. There are those like ExxonMobil, who are very happy to unashamedly say, look, our job is to make money. And Exxon does that very well. I mean, I'm not criticizing Exxon for it, but they're very clear on their mission statement that we are trying to create superior financial and operating results. There are these other companies for whom a purpose is genuinely an overarching goal. And I've got the Tata Group. Now remember, Tata is a holding company which owns stakes in Tata Steel and Tata Motors and Tata Consulting. So Tata Group, Tata & Sons, has a very explicit mission to improve the quality of life for the communities they serve. And they invest enormously in those communities. And a lot of what they do is indeed charitable work. They are still running highly profitable companies, or intendedly profitable companies, underneath their holding. But this drives a lot of what they do. And you're all familiar, I think, with Unilever's sustainable development goals. Paul Polman at Unilever has become quite a sort of a champion of this notion that a big PLC can also have higher order goals that people care about, whilst also delivering results. So, in this worldview, as I say, the Tatas of this world, when studies have been done, they've actually shown that on average, when you take these companies with clear higher order purposes, they actually tend to outperform the ones which have taken this incredibly narrow shareholder-driven view. And the reason for that is simply that if you are maximizing shareholder value year after year after year, you are deliberately putting your money into the short-term things which you know will deliver a result, rather than those investments which might yield a return in 5 or 10 years' time. ICI used to be Britain's biggest, most successful industrial company. ICI no longer exists. And the reason for that, I would argue, is that about 20 years ago, ICI, after a failed takeover bid, decided that it was going to maximize shareholder value, and it did that essentially by dismembering itself. Every step that ICI took was essentially to sell off pieces of the business to the highest bidder when a bidder could come along. They had no point of view other than to try to make sure that their shareholders did well. So shareholders in ICI did just fine, but that company no longer exists, and I think that is a loss. So, put it all together, we can't completely avoid the question about individual incentives in this conversation. I've already touched on this, but let me just say a bit more about it. It is impossible in my worldview to design a system of extrinsic motivators. Extrinsic meaning, essentially, we pay you a financial return for the work you do. It's impossible to design a motivation system around financial bonuses which encourages the sort of collaboration we want. Now, you can mandate specific types of collaboration, but the whole purpose of a conversation like this about collaboration is that we as the people at the top of the organization don't know what collaboration is needed. We need the people lower down to be figuring that out for themselves. And any incentive system which drives people towards particular bonuses is almost certainly going to have the negative consequences. So, and this is a picture, by the way, of Douglas McGregor, who was this MIT psychologist who coined these terms theory X and theory Y. And essentially he said, to paraphrase, extrinsic motivation is a sort of an old-fashioned way of motivating people which works under a very specific set of circumstances and assumes certain types of attitudes and behaviors in our people. If we want to get genuine high-performance companies, including collaboration and initiative and so forth, we need a different theory, a theory which assumes that people are well-intentioned and highly motivated and that they will do the right things. And under those circumstances, it's very clear that the types of motivators that we use are more about giving people worthwhile work to do and giving them freedom to do it rather than doing it through incentive compensation. So to summarize and to conclude, I've made a case that our traditional model of management might have worked in the industrial era, but it certainly doesn't work in today's digital era. And if I can kind of boil it down to a simple logic of arithmetic, the old model was based on division. It was based on the idea that we take the firm and then we divide it up into pieces, and each piece does one part of the puzzle, but the pieces only come together again right at the end. The logic that I'm espousing here is a logic of multiplication, because multiplication says that when you take two activities at a low level and we bring them together, we will get often surprising and valuable outcomes. So that is my final slide. What are the core principles of collaboration? It starts with a clear sense of what we are doing, a purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning, a very clear sense of identity for what it is we're doing. Remember, this works at the level of an individual team as much as it does at the level of a company as a whole. Incentives based on some sort of collaborative group performance. Anyone here from John Lewis? I doubt it, but if there is, I think everybody knows John Lewis as a partnership gives everybody the same bonus as a percentage of their base salary. Literally everybody across the company gets the same bonus. And that is a very attractive model if you're trying to get people to work together. And then this point around openness and transparency as a provision of the necessary information to ensure that I simply know what my colleagues are doing. And sometimes all it takes is to have a greater clarity about what we're trying to do so that I can invest my time in the things which will be most valuable to my colleagues, and they will do likewise. And with that, I will finish. Thank you very much.